When my father passed away, my whole world shifted in a way I could never have imagined. His absence wasn't just the quiet at the dinner table or the stillness of his empty chair in the living room, it was like an entire part of my foundation had been removed. His name was Richard, and he was the kind of man people admired not because he was perfect, but because he was steady, dependable, and honest. My stepmother, Caroline, had been with my father for nearly 15 years. I was 27 when he passed, and Caroline had been in my life since I was a teenager. To me, she wasn't really a step anything anymore, she was just family. She had been there through my graduations, my heartbreaks, and even the messy parts of growing up. But when Dad passed, Caroline became a different person in ways I didn't expect. The funeral was quiet but beautiful. Family and friends filled the church, sharing stories of how my father had helped them, guided them, or simply made them laugh. I sat there, holding my mother's hand on one side and Caroline's on the other, realizing how strange life had become. My parents had divorced years ago, but they respected each other enough to sit in the same room with peace. Caroline, on the other hand, was stoic. She barely shed a tear, but her hands trembled when she held the folded American flag the honor guard presented her. Weeks passed, and I made it a point to visit Caroline at the house often. I worried about her being alone, rattling around in the big two-story home that suddenly felt far too empty. I expected grief, sadness, maybe even anger, but what I found instead was secrecy. One afternoon, about a month after the funeral, Caroline asked me to sit down at the dining room table. Her face was pale, her eyes red like she hadn't slept. She pushed a box across the table toward me. "What's this?" I asked, confused. "Your father's journals," she whispered. "He wrote almost every day. And before he died, he made me promise to give them to you. He said there were things inside that you needed to know." My heart pounded. Dad had never told me he kept journals. Slowly, I opened the box and lifted out one of the worn leather notebooks. His handwriting spilled across the pages, familiar, neat, and steady. I flipped to a random page and read about a camping trip we took together when I was 12. He wrote about how proud he was that I had caught my first fish and how much he treasured that memory. But then, Caroline stopped me. "There's more," she said firmly. "You need to read them carefully. Some of it may shock you." I looked at her. "Shock me how?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Your father wasn't always the man you thought he was." The next weeks became a blur of late nights, sitting in my small apartment, flipping through journal after journal. At first, it was all ordinary, daily accounts of work, memories of vacations, reflections on life. But as the pages turned, I started to notice entries that hinted at struggles, regrets, and secrets. One entry in particular made my stomach turn. It was dated 10 years ago. "I fear that one mistake I made years ago will destroy everything I've built. Caroline doesn't know, and I pray she never does. But if the truth comes out, I don't know if my son will ever look at me the same way again." My chest tightened. What mistake? What truth? I confronted Caroline the next day. She sat me down in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know what you found," she said softly. "I promised your father I'd tell you when the time was right. He had a relationship. It was a long time ago, before you were old enough to understand. He regretted it deeply. He thought it would break you to know the man you admired wasn't perfect." The air left my lungs. My father, the man I idolized, had betrayed the vows of marriage once. I didn't know what to feel. Anger. Sadness. Disappointment. It was like finding a crack in the foundation of a house you thought was unshakable. But Caroline wasn't finished. She pulled a letter out of a drawer and handed it to me. It was sealed, with my name on the front in my father's handwriting. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside, my father's words spilled across the page, raw and heartfelt. He admitted his mistake. He wrote about how ashamed he was, how he nearly lost himself, and how Caroline's forgiveness had saved him. He said he never wanted me to think of him as flawless, but as human, someone who fell, but also someone who fought to make things right. He ended the letter with this: "Son, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you myself. I made choices I regret, But I also made one choice I will never regret, being your father. If you learn anything from me, let it be this: your mistakes don't define you. How you make things right does. Tears blurred my vision. I looked up at Caroline, who was crying silently. That's what I needed you to know, she whispered. That's why your father made me promise to give you the journals. He wanted you to understand that even though he stumbled, his love for you was the truest part of his life. In that moment, I realized Caroline's shocking request hadn't been about exposing my father, it was about preserving him, about making sure I saw the whole man, not just the pieces I admired. Over time, my anger faded, replaced by something deeper: compassion. My father wasn't perfect, but none of us are. He had carried the weight of his secret for years, and yet, he still managed to be the man who raised me, guided me, and loved me. Caroline and I grew closer after that. We talked often about Dad, about memories both joyful and painful. I helped her pack away some of his belongings, and together we donated his clothes to charity. Every time we opened a box, we found another piece of him: photos, letters, little souvenirs from trips. Each item reminded me that he was more than his mistakes. He was a man, a father, and someone who loved fiercely, even if imperfectly. Months later, I returned to the journals. This time, I read them not with shock, but with understanding. They became a roadmap, showing me that life isn't about avoiding failure, it's about rising after you fall. And that became my inheritance. Not money, not possessions, but wisdom. A reminder that honesty, forgiveness, and love carry more weight than any secret ever could. Even now, years later, when I face challenges, I hear my father's words in my head: your mistakes don't define you. How you make things right does. That was his legacy. And that's the truth I carry with me every single day.